Mr. Potter and Tabby Picked the Pears by Cynthia Ryland. Illustrated by Arthur Howard. 1. Pear Jelly. It was fall, and juicy things were growing in Mr. Potter's backyard. Juicy apples, juicy tomatoes, juicy pears. Mr. Potter walked with his fine cat, Tabby, among the juicy things, and he dreamed. He dreamed of apple pie and apple turnovers. He dreamed of hot apple cider with a cinnamon stick and stuffed red tomatoes. But most of all, he dreamed of pear jelly. Mr. Potter loved pear jelly. He had loved it since he was a boy. Fall was his favorite season because of pear jelly. And now it was time.
"Tabby,"
said Mr. Potter,
"it is time to pick the pears."
Tabby loved it when Mr. Potter said it was time to do something. She was old, but she still liked excitement. She followed Mr. Potter into the garage, where he found a ladder for pear picking. Then they went to the backyard, where all the excitement was. 2. Cranky Legs. Mr. Potter had a problem. It was a ladder problem. Mr. Potter set his ladder against the pear tree, but he couldn't get up the ladder. Last year he got up the ladder, but this year he had cranky legs. Cranky legs, cranky knees, cranky feet. He stepped onto the ladder, and his legs were so cranky he had to get right off again.
"One trouble with being old,"
said Mr. Potter,
"is being cranky."
Tabby knew what he meant. She had a cranky tail. Some days it was so cranky it wouldn't swish. It just stuck in the air, like a stick. Cranky legs and cranky tails are no fun when you're old, especially if you want pear jelly. Mr. Potter looked at the pears still in his tree, and he thought. He thought and thought and thought. Tabby curled herself up and waited. She liked excitement, but she could wait for it. 3. Zing.
"What I need,"
said Mr. Potter at last,
"is a good slingshot."
Mr. Potter knew about slingshots. He had played with them as a boy. They were good for knocking cans off logs, so they must be good for knocking pears off trees. Tabby followed him into the house to make a slingshot. Mr. Potter found a pair of old underwear that he didn't like. He didn't like it because it was covered with poodles. His brother had given him the underwear for his birthday. His brother loved the underwear. He thought it was funny. Mr. Potter did not. So he cut up the underwear and got some very good elastic. Then he got an old glove. Then he got a stick, and he made his slingshot. Mr. Potter and Tabby went back to the pear tree. Mr. Potter needed something hard and round to sling. Many of his apples had already fallen, so he picked up an apple. He put the apple in the slingshot, he aimed at a pear in the tree, and he pulled back as hard as he could. Zing! The hard, round apple went flying, up, 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 over Mr. Potter's pear tree, over Mr. Potter's apple tree, over Mr. Potter's chimney, over Mr. Potter's house. Mr. Potter and Tabby watched as it flew out of sight. Said Mr. Potter. He picked up another apple. Zing! Up, 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 over, 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 out of sight.
"Wow!"
said Mr. Potter, and he was smiling. He might have cranky legs, but he sure had jiffy hands. He picked up another apple. Zing! Another apple. Zing! Another. Zing! He forgot all about the pears. Tabby liked the first zings, but by the 7th zing she began to yawn. By the 10th zing she began to nod, and by the 14th zing she was sound asleep. Mr. Potter played with his slingshot all afternoon. He played through tea time. He played through supper time. He played until dark, when he couldn't see the apples go up anymore. when he was finished, he had no apples, and no pear jelly. He was a little embarrassed. He picked up Tabby and sneaked inside. 4. Juicy Days. The next afternoon, Mr. Potter and Tabby were sitting on their porch. They were feeling sorry for themselves because they still had no pear jelly. Suddenly, Mr. Potter's neighbor, Mrs. Teaberry, and her good dog Zeke came by. Mrs. Teaberry was carrying a big basket, a very big basket. She said to Mr. Potter, "It is amazing. When I woke up this morning, there were dozens of apples in my front yard, and I don't even have an apple tree." Mr. Potter looked at Tabby.
Amazing,
he said. "So I made an apple feast," said Mrs. Teaberry. In the basket, she had 14 apple turnovers, 5 apple pies, 6 apple jellies, and a gallon of hot apple cider with cinnamon sticks. Mr. Potter and Tabby ate juicy things for days and days. And when he was finishing the last apple pie, Mr. Potter had an idea about those pears still on his pear tree. He would wait for them all to fall off. Then he would get his slingshot and start zinging.